Welcome back to John. In this video, we're looking at another resurrection story in the second half of chapter 20, starting at verse 19. Last time we saw the discovery by Mary Magdalene that the tomb was empty and Jesus was alive. Peter and John came and saw the empty tomb but didn't see Jesus like Mary did. And now verse 19 of chapter 20 says, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together. Now, for a Jewish person, the first day of the week is Sunday. The week goes from Sunday to Saturday, with Friday evening through Saturday evening being the Sabbath, the day of rest. And just so it's clear in all of our minds, the Last Supper, when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, which was followed by all of that teaching in chapters 13 through 16, and then his prayer in chapter 17, his arrest in the garden in chapter 18, all of that was Thursday night. Jesus was arrested on Thursday, tried before the Jewish leaders late that night, held overnight at the high priest's house, tried before Pilate on Friday morning, and was probably on the cross by sometime around 9 a.m. on Friday. He was on the cross for about 6 hours. He died sometime in the middle of the afternoon and was buried on Friday before the sun went down. And then, because that was the beginning of the Sabbath, he was in the tomb undisturbed all that night and all the next day. And then when the Sabbath ended on Saturday evening, the sun was down again. It was dark, too late to do anything. So Mary and the other women came on Sunday morning to care for the body and discovered that he had risen. So when you hear people say that Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days, that has to do with the way the Jews counted days. If any part of the day was included, then that counted as a day. He was in the tomb for part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday. In reality, it was just 2 nights from sunset on Friday to sunrise on Sunday, or about 36 hours. But this story now, in the second half of chapter 20, takes place on Sunday night. So the disciples have had all day to process the news from Mary and the women and from Peter and John. They've gathered together for dinner with the doors locked because they're afraid that those who crucified Jesus will come after them. And it says, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you, and showed them his hands and his side. And there are several things worth noting just in those 2 verses. First of all, locked doors are not a problem for Jesus in his resurrected body. So there's something miraculous going on there. It sounds like he just sort of appeared. But then he shows them his hands and his side. They're overjoyed to see him, which means he still has a physical body. He bears the scars he received in the body, and he looks like himself. They recognize him. In the book of Philippians, chapter 3, verse 21, there's this incredible promise from God, which says that when Jesus returns and takes believers to be with him for eternity, he will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. In heaven, we will have bodies. Eternal life will be physical. We won't be floating spirits. We'll be real people living in a real place. We'll still be us. We'll recognize each other, but they won't be these lowly bodies. They'll be transformed to be like the one that Jesus has now. So who knows? Maybe locked doors won't be a problem for us either in eternity. But I think what's more important for us right now is Jesus' statement here, peace be with you. He actually repeats that in verse 21. He says it again because I think he knows that they are far from being at peace. These last couple of days for the disciples have been just traumatic. They've been through his arrest. They're dealing with their own shame at having abandoned him. And then there was his trial, his crucifixion, over 24 hours of sitting with their grief and their anger and their shame mixed with the fear of the authorities coming after them. And then the really confusing news this morning. It's just been a lot. And Jesus says, peace be with you. One of the things that Christ's death and resurrection mean for us is that peace is possible. In the midst of whatever chaos or pain or fear is a part of our lives right now, Jesus can bring us peace because he's conquered sin and death. He has overcome this world, as he said in chapter 16. And he says the same thing, peace be with you, a week later when he appears again in much the same way, only this time Thomas is with them. Thomas wasn't there the first time and couldn't believe the news. Wouldn't believe, he said, unless he was able to put his finger where the nails were, put his hand into Jesus' side where the spear had pierced him. Thomas needs proof. Even the testimony of his close friends isn't enough. So the next Sunday night, the same thing happens. Jesus appears in the locked room again, and he says, "Peace be with you." And then he gives Thomas exactly what Thomas said he needed, even though Thomas hasn't opened his mouth yet. Just a reminder, that Jesus hears all of our conversations. Put your finger here, he says. Reach out your hand. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas does believe. He calls Jesus my Lord and my God. And then Jesus makes this famous statement in verse 29, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now, that is something Jesus really said at that time to Thomas, but it's also pretty clear that John includes it here, not just as a statement to Thomas, but to everyone who's reading this book, because that's exactly what John is challenging us to do, to believe in Jesus, even though we haven't physically seen the resurrected Christ. So he records this statement where Jesus tells us that God really values faith. And then verses 30 and 31 are a reminder that faith is the reason this whole book was written. John says that Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book. So this is just a sample that we've seen. Over the course of 3 years of public ministry, Jesus did a lot more than just what we've read. And specifically, he did a lot more other miraculous signs after his resurrection. You can read the last chapters of the book of Luke to see some of those. But John says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And that is actually such a key verse in the book of John that we're going to do a separate video just to talk about it, just to take a look at that one verse, John chapter 30, verse 31. So take a look at that one, at 20, verse 31, sorry. And then we'll finish up the whole book after that. Thank you.